The term supply chain has grown in prominence over the last couple of months, from a relatively obscure topic reserved for a few experts to something which is regularly discussed by the media. As such, today we're going to go back to basics and unpick exactly what is meant by the term supply chain. So Janice, it sounds like a fairly academic kind of subject today. Is there anything to be really gained by defining what is supply chain?
Yes, and clarifying, terms is I think a very important element of progress in general, including technological progress. Usually, until you have the proper vocabulary to even describe, the universe, etc., it is very difficult to even reason about things. For example, until physics clarified the notion of force, there were tons of things that were nearly unthinkable. It was very, very hard to think about simple things like gravity before you had anything that was like force. And ultimately, it turned out that gravity is seemingly not a force, but I digress. So fast forward, I would say for supply chain, it's a sort of topic that can be very fuzzy, very broad. And so when people speak of supply chain excellence or they want to improve their supply chain, what are we even talking about? How do we even know whether we are, I would say, in the right direction, etc. And I'm not talking of I would say of KPIs. I'm talking of conceptually, are we even in the area of the supply chain field, or are we even doing something else? I mean, it's obviously, if you have a large company and you want to, and it's complex to organize, I think it's best if you have, I would say, a sharp definition and sharp concepts to structure your company, and supply chain is one of them.
Okay, and when supply chain was used probably in the media over the last couple of months, it was used as a very kind of broad term, whereas when we discuss about supply chain in terms of a company, it's often much more on sort of narrow focus. So are we even kind of talking about the same things here?
Not really. I mean, when you hear in the media like, oh, there was a problem with toilet paper, it's a supply chain thing. So basically, what they said was there was a lot of stockouts. Okay, so that was first part of this. It was, I would say, a more elaborate way to say we had faced tons of stockouts. So that was that hence the term supply chain. So that makes you look smarter, I would say. And then if you can also, when you say the supply chain are all the companies that are interconnected to end up delivering some certain set of products. Then basically what you have, the term supply chain can be interchanged with ecosystem. So from the media perspective, you could use, when you say, oh, we have a problem in supply chain, we are too dependent on China for electronics. You could actually rephrase this sentence by just saying, we have a problem, the ecosystem of consumer electronics is in China. That would be pretty much the same sentence from the media perspective. There is no nuance and subtlety between the two. So I would say, and that's typically the macro perspective, the macroeconomic perspective, where you look at networks of companies. And I would say this perspective is interesting from, I would say, mostly an academic perspective. From an operational perspective, from the perspective of one company, unless you happen to be like a super, super gigantic company that can shape the world economy around you, usually, I mean, it's a perspective that is a bit moot. It's just like the interest rate of the central bank. The central bank decide the interest rate. You can think about that, but you can't really do anything about that. So it's more like it's something that is basically outside your control, and thus it's interesting to be informed, but you can't really act on it. So I would say this macro perspective is not that much of interest. On the contrary, when people say, I'm the director of supply chain, you're not director of the supply chain of consumer electronics in China. You are the director of the supply chain of one company that is making one specific of component, and that has suppliers and clients, and that is just in between plenty of other companies on one side, the other side.
Okay, And obviously, when we first started talking about doing this topic, us, like probably many high school students, sort of turned to Wikipedia for the definition. So if we start off maybe with the definition of supply chain, it's in commerce, a supply chain is a system of organizations, people, activities, information, and resources involved in supplying a product or a service to a consumer. So it says supply chain activities involve the transformation of natural resources, raw materials, and components into a finished product that is delivered to the end customer. So, as a first off, maybe sort of how well does that kind of definition work from your perspective?
Not too well, not too well. I think this is almost entirely missing the point. I would say almost. So, what is the problem? I mean, there is a series of problems with this I would say textbook definition that you can find on the Wikipedia. And it's not just the Wikipedia. If you read books about supply chains, usually you will get a definition, I would say, along similar lines. So it's not just that this one page on the Wikipedia is garbage. It's literally it's a fairly, I would say, accurate synthesis of what you will find in most of the supply chain literature. And yet, my personal opinion is that it's not worth much. So what are the problem with this definition? First, there is a bit of a confusion with supply chain, as a field of expertise, of interest, on a certain perspective on human affairs. And I would say the objects themselves that are involved. If I make an analogy, just to clarify a bit this point, what is physics about? You could say physics is all there is with matters and everything in the universe. And no, physics is not all there is in the universe. Physics is about discovering the fundamental principles that governs all the interaction that you can find at a fundamental level in matter. So you see, physics is about those fundamental interactions. So when you are a physician, it doesn't mean that you manage enormous amount of mass. This is not what physics is about. It's the study of those fundamental interactions. So you see, one of the first problems that I see with this definition is that if you say, okay, this definition that goes like, it's all the people, processes, devices, tools that goes from the raw materials to the finished good, and you end up thinking that supply chain, as a discipline, as an intellectual perspective, on this on those human affairs, is like all of the things that have just been listed, and yet supply chain is not manufacturing. This is not that doesn't include the mastery of the physical processes to, for example, it doesn't include metallurgy. It doesn't include human psychology. Some parts yes, but mostly no. It doesn't include the fact that automotive and how you can actually design trucks. You use trucks, but designing, producing them is kind of not exactly your concern unless you are a truck manufacturer. So you see, the problem is that you list all of that, and if you read this definition, that would be my first objection, would be that if you read this definition and you ask yourself what would be, according to this definition, a director of supply chain, in I would say a company, this person would be pretty much the CEO. This person has all control over everything, all the things that are related to the flow of physical goods. So that would be the head of manufacturing, the head of production, of operation, of everything. Obviously, usually it's not. It's not. So my first objection is that you confuse, the subject of interest with the thing itself. And just like, doing physics is about uncovering the laws, supply chain is not all the things that happen happen to be present in a supply chain.
If I also give you sort of the definition of supply chain management, you'll see they're very kind of similar. So supply chain management is the flow of goods and services, involves the movement and storage of raw materials, of work in process inventory, and of finished goods, as well as end-to-end order fulfillment from point of origin to point of consumption. It's very similar to sort of the definition for supply chain. So why is it we're even distinguishing between the two?
I believe the distinction between supply chain and supply chain management is literally the consequence of how history is being made in this field. Most disciplines are actually academic, physics, biology, etc. So the history is written by academics. In supply chain, most of the history is actually written by consultants for good or bad reasons. It's just that there is, if you have like a new, better, fancy theory of supply chain, you can actually sell it to many, many companies. So it's very attractive. And if you look at many of the influential books historically in supply chain, they were actually written by consultants. And it's not completely an accident, because the only way to learn about the supply chain is, to interact with many large companies. And what better ways to do that but to be a consultant, so that you can go from one company to the next, under relatively short duration. And then that presents, the interesting thing is that when you look at it like this, then you can understand that you have certain bias, I would say mechanical bias, in the very way this knowledge is generated. One bias is that if you generate knowledge and you have uncovered something of genuine interest, you want to be able to sell it to your clients. And who are your clients? They are managers. So I would say first, the primary difference between supply chain and supply chain management is a matter of branding of the knowledge itself. Because if you brand that as supply chain management, you can directly, make it more, sellable to your clients as a consultant. And obviously, because knowledge is relayed by other consultants, so even if you're a successful consultant, there will be others that will read your theories and start to promote them so that they can sell mission on their own, etc., etc. And again, I'm not saying that this sort of behaviors are bad. They are just fine. They're just fine. But it means that you just have to be aware of the certain type of biases. And so I would say you end up with a certain, I would say, bias toward the fact that you have to sell to the upper management. And thus you tend to have, I would say, a bias toward what can I sell that makes sense to you being the supply chain director, rather than to you, somebody with a no name at the very bottom of the pyramid. And you have to be aware that because of this bias, it's kind of a tough sales usually to have something that is a bit more abstract, just because it's not something that is directly aligned to a certain path to sell consulting mission as well.
Okay, so we've spoken about a lot of the problems between sort of definition of supply chain, the definition of supply chain management. So in your opinion then, what would be a good definition of a supply chain?
So a better, maybe not a good one, but a better one, a better one would be, that would be company-wide. So the supply chain is company-wide, concerning the flow of physical goods, the mastery of optionality when facing variability. You see, the very short version would be the mastery of optionality when facing variability.
Okay, and what do you mean by optionality here?
So let's unpack a bit all of that. So the idea is that optionality is all the options that are available to you. So you have infrastructure. Let's say you build plants, you build warehouses, you buy trucks, and all of that, you can't change them. You're kind of stuck with those things for maybe a decade, sometimes more. And for example, your brand, your locations through the world, those are not things that you can change like that. You're stuck with those things, for the better and the worse, for long period of times. So, but there are lots of things that you can change pretty much at any point of time. your stock levels. For example, you can decide at any point of time that you want to buy more or less. You can decide to move stock around. That you can do that any point of time. You can decide to change your prices up or down and any point of time. So what I mean by optionality, I mean all those options that are available to you and that you can change rapidly with, I would not say that there is no capital involved, but it's compared to everything else, such as, for example, research and development, creating a brand that has a very strong value, identifying markets that really fit, your products, etc. It's much more, I would say, short term, and those things are kind of always present. So optionality, and it's not just the fact that you're going. And when I say optionalities are all those options, and when I say mastering the optionality, I mean that you are not neutral with regard of those options that are available to you. First, you get to decide. So you have many options, and you can exercise them or not. So that means that it's not just that you have a supplier that can provide something for you. Is that at some point you decide whether you buy or you don't, and which quantity. So that you have options and you exercise them. And I would say part of the mastery, I would even say that you nurture your options. So you want to put yourself in a position where the options available for your company are plentiful. So you have plenty of options. Now, why do you need all those options? And that goes to the second part of my sentence, which is it's mastering optionality when facing variability. It's because you spend decades to build your brand. You spend decades to do research and development, accumulating patents, building technologies, building infrastructure, tons of things. But the market is always fluctuating in unpredictable ways to a large extent. And even what you do can have, I would say, uncertain results to a certain extent. Obviously, if you are, let's say, a farmer, you have both the uncertainty of the market, whether your products, whether the price of what you're producing, which is a commodity, will be high or low. So that's external variability, and you have your own harvest that can be, plentiful or scarce. And that will be, your inner viability. And from even if you're like a manufacturer, you still have inner viability. Sometimes your lead times are a bit varying. Sometimes you have a batch that fails, because you have a quality problem. So you see, it's although there is typically a lot more variability outside of your company, especially variabilities that you cannot control. Usually, variability, is also very much present inside your company, and thus. You have all those things, that are kind of noisy, unpredictable to a certain extent, only to a certain extent, and thus having those options available let you cope with that, so that you're not completely stuck in a corner. You see something, the market is there is a spike of demand. Well, you were fortunate enough to have like a big safety stock in place that gives you the option to serve this somewhat unexpected surge of demand. So you've created option on one side to deal with viabilities that you cannot completely control on the other side. And I would argue that this mastery is very much what supply chain is about.
Okay, let's look at things maybe now from a company's perspective. Obviously, like a definition is just really a convention at the end of the day. So why should a company really care about something like this?
Because I would argue that if you adopt this definition, then you realize that the sort of skills and mindset and perspective that you have in your supply chain division becomes something that is very consistent. And thus you will have truly synergetic effect of having those things together. And because when you think about it, you see, when you want to do, for example, to optimize, so I'm talking about this viability. To master this viability, you need to have better forecast. So you see, it's a very analytical, quantitative type of skills. So if you are building a team, to get good results, you would probably seek people that are very analytical and quite quantitatively minded. On the other hand, if you want to manage truck drivers, does it make sense? Is it the same sort of skills? Do you need somebody who is like very good at math to do that? Probably not. And so that's why, for example, if you follow this sort of definition, that can tell you what are sort of good ideas and bad ideas. For example, if you, under the supply chain umbrella, if you're putting things like planning and logistics under the same umbrella, that's not going to give you very good results, because you could see that on one side, you want someone who is going to essentially manage truck drivers, which is very difficult. It's a very tough job. So I'm not saying that it's easy extra, but I'm saying that it's, in terms of type of difficulty, it's something that is completely different from having a good forecast. And you can be a fantastic, I would say, a statistical analyst and a completely crappy, manager of truck drivers, and vice versa. You see, there is zero correlation between the type of skills that you have. Thus, you want a definition that gives you a good umbrella as a criterion of what should you put together in order to have like consistent teams that works well and that gives you, that have the sort of internal dynamics that are very positive for your company.
Okay, so if we kind of look ahead to the future a little bit then, can you see kind of that definition of supply chain kind of evolving, and what do you see in kind of the next decade, the next 20 years?
So interestingly, there are many companies that have kind of, I believe, perceived that. And there are, for example, if you go, it's literally on LinkedIn, if you look at, let's say, Zalando, you will see that the people who are working on inventory optimization and pricing, they are essentially the same people. And they are working on the same division, and they might have like a director of inventory optimization and pricing optimization. I'm not too sure if this role exists at Zalando presently, but I've seen people that were really along similar lines. Again, public information. And that's very interesting, because those people, they don't have the title of supply chain director, but in my book, they are as close as you can get to, I would say, a role of director of supply chain. You are basically bringing under the same umbrella the things that, what are your options, where your stock level, if you're a retailer, like Zalando is, e-commerce, but a retailer, your options are basically what you buy and the price at which you sell. And then as a third, probably sort of options, that would be assortment optimization. So you have to decide what is part of your assortment, then you decide how much you buy, and then you decide at which price you sell. And that gives, as I would say, the broad picture of the options that are available to you at any point of time as a retailer. And so if I look, so interestingly, I see that some companies that are, I believe, to be, ahead of their peers, are already consolidating all those things, and they don't even have necessarily somebody with the title supply chain. And if I look at, I would say, more traditional companies, I usually see supply chain directors who basically end up both leading the s&op. So obviously you have kind of some bits of that. So basically they deal with the analytical parts, the forecasting, the planning, the scheduling, but they don't necessarily go to the point where they actually make the decisions, which kind of where they're losing some substance, So it means that they produce a forecast, but they don't have to follow through. It's other people who have to take the final decisions for them, and then you end up with, I would say, supply chain divisions that can be, I would say, very weak in the sense they are just a division that produce all the numbers that everybody else ignore. So I expect this sort of division to kind of pretty much disappear in the next 2 decades. And similarly, I expect also the supply chain division where you conflate, I would say, supply chain management as in, the operations, just the mundane, ongoing execution of the operations, and typically to also disappear just because it's not the same skills. And here you have, I would say, the typical, I would say, anti-pattern would be to either bring IT in supply chain, because obviously supply chain are exceedingly dependent on enterprise software. So basically, some companies say, "Oh, I'm going to bring basically the IT division under the umbrella of supply chain, and I also bring logistics under the umbrella of supply chain." But then the problem is when you do that is that you're completely stuck with super mundane details of your day-to-day operations. And if you go back to my definition, which is mastery of optionality when facing variability, you literally don't have time to even think about the future, make good forecasts, think about your option, conceptualize them, and optimize, and also sort of things. You're completely stuck with, I would say, with IT, you're completely stuck with mountains of bugs. You have always bugs. And thousands of open tickets about things that you've not fixed and decide not to fix. And then if you're in the operations, you're always stuck with mountains of super operational problems, such as you have people that are unhappy and that go on strike. Okay, that might be a French thing, but you can have all sorts of other very mundane things where sometimes, again, there is no air conditioning in the warehouse and it's just too damn hot and people refuse to work for very, very good reason. That did happen, to Amazon, for example. So it's not, and obviously if you're completely unglued, entangled with this sort of problems, it's very, very hard for you to still have, I would say, intellectual bandwidth to think of those problems of mastering the optionality facing variability. And thus, in conclusion, I would say 20 years ahead, I believe that survivors of this market, because remember, market don't educate, markets just filter. I suspect that surviving companies will have identified the fact that in order to have a very good supply chain division, you need to have people that kind of specialize on those problems that I've just described, and push away the other very important problems, because they are very, very important, but due to the fact that they are not the same type of problem and they don't require the same skills, there is no really much of a point of basically putting under the same umbrella. Obviously, those people still need to talk to each other, but it's very, very different skills.
Okay, we'll have to wrap it up there, but maybe we should try and get that Wikipedia definition changed. So that's everything for this week. Thanks very much for tuning in, and we'll see you again in the next episode. Bye for now.